So, a lot of the time, I think Joseph gets kind of short shrift, don't you think? I mean, can anyone think of any Christmas carols that are about Joseph? I mean, I don't know if you noticed, but we had to resort to a Mary carol about the angel, the Annunciation today, because they don't really have the Joseph ones. But the truth is that there are two Gospels that include a birth narrative, and one of them, Matthew's, makes Joseph a central figure in the Christmas story. There's no shepherds in Matthew's telling. There's no mangers. There's no empty inn. And not even Mary is that prominent in the story, but Joseph, it's told quite a lot of it from his point of view. Now, we only read this version once every 3 years, so we can be forgiven if we kind of forget that it's right there in the mix. We do get the Magi every year. That's the part that seems to get the big play from Matthew's Gospel. But Joseph is a really key part, because this is Matthew's telling of how Joseph came to be Jesus, the Messiah's earthly father. I think it's worth looking at closely, because there is an awful lot going on here that's key to Matthew's proclamation of the good news. Matthew's language throughout this story is kind of sparse. It's enough to make us miss Luke. Luke, he loves the people bursting into songs, almost like it's musical theater. There's a lot of drama. Matthew's is a little bit more like, quick PowerPoint pictures. It's very to the point, which is great because it leaves it open for us to speculate. That's what Judaism would call midrash. We get to ask all of our questions. We get to start to try to fill in some of those gaps so that we can gain some deeper theological insight into what's going on in Joseph's story. We get to ask questions like, how exactly did Joseph find out that Mary was pregnant? Now, Matthew doesn't really tell us. He just says she was found to be with child. It does tell us that it is from the Holy Spirit that she's found to be with child, but it doesn't really specify if that's how Joseph understood it before that angel came to talk to him. It's possible that Joseph just found out that his fiancée had a bun in the oven and it was not his. It's not even clear that Joseph found out this news from Mary at all, or even if Mary knows the fullness of what's going on yet at this point. The Annunciation story, the one that we sung about in that wonderful hymn, and that we're all really familiar with, where the angel comes and talks to Mary, that's Luke's gospel. I sincerely hope that Joseph did not hear about Mary being pregnant from, like the village gossip line or something like that, but we just don't know. Either way, it's safe to assume that he's probably just had a really tense conversation with Mary. She was likely crying, saying she doesn't understand how this happened. Now, all that Joseph really knows is that this is not his child. We can ask questions like, did he believe Mary at first? Or did he make a bitter but understandable comment like, how does it usually happen, Mary? We don't know. Joseph's initial reaction is a mystery to us because Matthew doesn't give us that part. So we're left to imagine. Imagine how Joseph must have felt angry, betrayed, hurt. Now, I know that history remembers Joseph as a saint, but even a saint could be forgiven for losing his cool in these kinds of circumstances, don't you think? Yeah. Now, betrothed wasn't married, but in that day and time, it was pretty much everything but. Joseph's and Mary's two whole extended families had agreed probably years and years ago that a marriage would be made between Mary and Joseph. Contracts had been negotiated, bride price had been paid, and all that was left to happen was for the time to come when Mary would have been brought from her father's house to Joseph's to live where and become his wife. Now, even though a betrothed couple wasn't yet living together as husband and wife, in the eyes of their community, this news of Mary turning up pregnant, it would have been seen as adultery. If they were following the code of law that is written in Deuteronomy, Mary could have been stoned to death for this kind of transgression. Yet Matthew tells us that whatever it was that Joseph may or may not have understood up front about the situation, and whatever it is that he's feeling about it, Joseph chooses compassion. He must have really loved Mary because he chooses to shelter her from the public consequences of her situation and instead just dismiss her quietly. Joseph's choice in this situation, it's, I have to say, remarkable. He has every right to publicly shame her, and instead he chooses to show her mercy. We could, I think, call it grace. It is not a small thing. It's almost as if Joseph has heard Jesus preaching from that Sermon on the Mount all those years later and proclaiming, "You have heard it said that an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth is the law. But I say to you, if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other one also." Now, it is no coincidence that this version of the Sermon on the Mount, these words, they are part of Matthew's gospel as well. Because Matthew's Jesus teaches everyone about the choices that we face between following the letter of the law and following the spirit, or choosing the spirit of the law. And Jesus, as he's portrayed in Matthew's gospel, emphasizes that it is the latter way, the spirit of the law, that is the way of God's love. So too, Matthew gives us a Joseph who puts this principle into action in an incredible, huge, and magnanimous way. But then, God gives Joseph something even bigger for him to take on board, because an angel shows up in his dream. Now, this is clearly not the comforting and fluffy or protective type of angel, but that messenger type of angel that comes to bring terrifying requests from God. The message starts out, "Do not be afraid," which usually means there is definitely something to be afraid of. In Joseph's case, this angel is showing up with an affirmation of the baby's origin, and also a frightening instruction. Take Mary as your wife. Publicly adopt her baby as your own, Joseph. He's being asked to raise someone else's child. He's being asked to raise God's child. And once again, Joseph chooses to take this path of love. As Matthew tells it, Joseph simply acquiesces. But you know what? It cannot have been an easy choice. In fact, it was a life life-altering choice for Joseph. It's also a hugely important and pivotal choice in Matthew's gospel. Now, in ancient Near East society, naming was claiming. And this moment is a double naming. A naming of Joseph's son and a naming of God's Messiah. By that very act of naming Jesus, Joseph is publicly declaring to all that this child is his. And Joseph not only gives Jesus his love and his nurture and his protection, but Joseph is also giving Jesus his family lineage, which is what makes Jesus eligible to be the Messiah according to the traditions of the prophets, because the Messiah needed to be a descendant of David. Now, you can see why Joseph's story is pivotal to Matthew's gospel, which opens up with a claim to be the account of Jesus, the Messiah, and with a name, Jesus, which we know is literally means God saves. Then we know that this baby, this child, is the one through whom God will save us. So Joseph's choice to marry Mary and raise Jesus as his son, well, it is essential to Matthew's audience. It's essential to this entire proclamation of the good news of God in Jesus Christ, the Messiah. But what does Joseph's story tell us today? Well, fundamentally, I think it tells us that Christmas is about our choice to love like God loved us. Because even when it seems ridiculously irrational or unbelievably hard to do, we always have a choice to love unconditionally with grace and with compassion. How many of you have watched recently that classic animated version of How the Grinch Stole Christmas? Anyone get to see it this year? See, when I was a kid, maybe some of you remember this, it used to be on every year in December, and you actually made time to watch it. Now, it's kind of on you. You get to choose. It's probably streaming, or I bet you could find it on YouTube. But it's beautiful because it is so deeply faithful to the original story that Dr. Seuss wrote. It's funny, at 8 o'clock, Anne, who's French, she didn't know which one we were talking. She hadn't grown up with this. But you know how she remembered it? Remember the song? Mm-hmm. You're a mean one, Mr. Grinch. She's heard the song, so. It takes you right down into that place of how sometimes you lose track of what Christmas is all about. And I just learned something interesting, because did anyone know that Dr. Seuss based the character of the Grinch on himself? No. I had no idea. I just found this out. Apparently, Theodore Geisel, when he was young, had railed against the hubbub and pop mythos of Christmas all through his college days and writing for the Dartmouth Humor magazine. And some of it is just plain scathing, I have to say. But then he admits that he only really questioned this attitude that he had long nursed towards Christmas when he was in middle age. He wrote in Red Book in 1957, "I was brushing my teeth on the morning of the 26th of last December when I noticed a very Grinch-ish countenance in the mirror. So I wrote about my sour friend, the Grinch, to see if I could rediscover something about Christmas that obviously I'd lost." And apparently the article It's accompanied with this wonderful illustration of his that's a self-portrait of himself looking in the mirror, and right there in the mirror there's Mr. Grinch, the face we all know and love. The thing is, Seuss and his Grinch, well, they're not wrong. Christmas is often overtaken with consumerism, and its meaning is frequently overshadowed by the glitter and the trite fluff that seems to appear pretty much from about 11:59 p.m. on October 31st these days. But the genius of his characterization of the Grinch is that his very astute critique also alienates him completely from what Christmas is really about, because instead of experiencing the true meaning of Christmas, where is he? He's up on a mountain, growling and complaining and plotting how he can ruin Christmas for everybody else too. And we all know that Christmas, what it should be about, is joy and celebration, caring, community, love, and grace. Well, I think the Grinch comes to discover that these are things that need to include a healthy dose of tolerance, good humor, and maybe even just a bit of trite fluff to bring us along for the ride. When the Grinch rediscovers all this, we find out that his heart, which originally was described as 2 sizes too small, now grows 3 whole sizes, so it's bigger than it was originally. There is somehow magic in all of this kind of trite silliness that comes with Christmas. It's the magic of transformation, of realizing that our lives, well, they really could hold more, of seeing what really matters anew. Now, you can call it the Christmas spirit if you like, but it is something that we dare not spurn. I think that all of the best and most ridiculous Christmas movies and books and stories and cartoons, all of that, tell stories of characters who, like Joseph and the Grinch, have had to make a choice between some sort of life that they expected or carved out for themselves carefully, maybe following the rules that they had been told to follow, and a life that could be so, so much more. They're asked to choose between doing what is seen as clever, wise, or prudent, or choosing to lean into the foolishness of living their life for others, family, community, and sometimes things like economic justice. There's all kinds of ways that you can do this, but ultimately it's about choosing love. Now, it's hard sometimes to see this fundamental aspect of Christmas if we just, walk out our front door, go to the grocery store. We see those lights flashing, there's advertising everywhere. But we, like Joseph and like Dr. Seuss, may need some magic to remind us that Christmas is, in fact, this kind of choice. So, we're lucky this year because Advent 4 is a Sunday, Christmas is a Sunday. That means we have 7 whole days. I invite all of you at some point this week to look in the mirror, listen to your dreams, take time for your families and giving, and open up your eyes to the injustices that are all around us. Ponder the ways that God may be calling you to transform, to re-engage your life in what matters, in love. And then I invite you to make a choice. You can, after that, return next Saturday evening or Sunday morning and celebrate together with your St. Philip's family the birth of Jesus, God with us, the one through whom God saves us, the one who ultimately calls all of us to love. Amen.